What would you do if you saw something that just didn't feel right? A tiny hint of fear, a glimpse of blood, and a door half open to a dark secret. Could you walk away? When Mr. Harris, the neighborhood mailman, notices something strange about Mrs. Cooks, he faces a decision that could mean the difference between safety and danger. Sometimes, a simple knock can change everything. Welcome to our channel, where we bring you powerful emotional stories that captivate your heart and stir your imagination. If you love tales that keep you on the edge of your seat, you're in the right place. It was a bright, sunny morning in the quiet neighborhood of Maple Street. The sky was clear, and the birds sang cheerfully as they hopped from tree to tree. It was a perfect day, and everything seemed calm and normal. Mr. Harris, the friendly neighborhood mailman, whistled a light tune as he rode his bike, delivering mail to each house along the street. He had been the mailman here for years, and he knew almost everyone by name. Every day was mostly the same, but that's how he liked it. As he approached Mrs. Cook's house, he slowed down. Mrs. Cooks was one of his favorite people on his route. She was an elderly lady who lived alone in a small, cozy house with a lovely flower garden out front. Every morning, she would be sitting on her porch, waving at him with a warm smile, and sometimes offering him a cookie or a piece of candy. Mr. Harris always looked forward to their little chats, even if they were just for a few minutes. But today was different. As he stopped in front of Mrs. Cook's house, he noticed that she wasn't on her porch like usual. The chair she always sat in was empty, rocking slightly in the breeze. Mr. Harris felt a small pang of worry in his chest. Maybe she was feeling under the weather, he thought. He decided to deliver the mail and keep going, but something in the back of his mind told him to check on her. He walked up to her front door and knocked gently. "Mrs. Cooks, it's Mr. Harris. I've got your mail for you," he called out, hoping to hear her cheerful voice in response. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, after a few seconds, the door creaked open, and Mrs. Cooks appeared. The sight of her made Mr. Harris freeze. Mrs. Cooks looked pale, and her face was tired and sad. Her usual smile was missing, and there were dark circles under her eyes. But what worried him most was that there were red stains on her light-colored pants. They looked like blood. Mrs. Cooks was holding the door slightly open, as if she didn't want him to see inside. "Good morning, Mrs. Cooks," Mr. Harris said softly, trying to sound normal. "I didn't see you outside, so I thought I'd check on you. Is everything okay?" Mrs. Cooks nodded quickly, but her eyes were nervous. "Oh yes, everything is fine, Mr. Harris," she said, but her voice was weak, almost a whisper. "Just a little accident, that's all." Mr. Harris's heart skipped a beat. "Are you sure? That looks like blood on your pants. Did you hurt yourself?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm. Mrs. Cooks glanced down at her pants, as if noticing the stains for the first time, and quickly pulled her sweater down to cover them. "It's nothing, really. I just had a little fall, that's all." "I'm fine," she insisted, but she didn't sound convincing. Mr. Harris was about to ask her more questions when he noticed something through the small gap in the door. Inside the house, just beyond where Mrs. Cooks was standing, there was a broken vase lying on the floor. Shards of glass were scattered across the carpet, and there was a dark red stain nearby. It looked like someone had tried to clean it up but hadn't finished. Mr. Harris felt a chill run down his spine. "Mrs. Cooks, are you sure everything is okay?" he asked again, his voice a little more serious now. He was trying to stay calm, but his mind was racing. Something was definitely wrong, and he didn't know what to do. Mrs. Cook's eyes darted back inside, and for a moment she looked scared. Then she quickly forced a smile and nodded. Yes, I'm sure. Thank you for checking on me, but I'm fine. I just need to rest." Mr. Harris hesitated, not sure whether to believe her. As he turned to leave, he saw the door open a little wider, just enough for him to see more of the room. His breath caught when he saw a trail of dark red spots leading from the hallway to the living room. There was something heavy and unsettling about the way the room felt, like it was hiding a terrible secret. Mrs. Cooks quickly closed the door, blocking his view, and that was when Mr. Harris knew he couldn't just walk away. As he stepped off the porch, his hands were shaking, and his mind was filled with questions. What had happened inside that house? Was Mrs. Cooks hurt, or was something worse going on? He couldn't bear the thought that something terrible might have happened to the kind old lady he had known for so many years. Mr. Harris took a deep breath and tried to think clearly. He knew he had to do something, but he didn't want to overreact. Maybe Mrs. Cooks was just embarrassed about a small accident. But what if it was more than that? What if she was in danger and needed help? He took out his phone, his fingers trembling as he dialed 911. When the operator answered, he explained what he had seen, his voice shaking slightly. "I'm not sure what's going on, but I think Mrs. Cooks might be in trouble. Please send someone to check on her," he said, his heart pounding. As he hung up the phone, Mr. Harris stood on the sidewalk, looking back at the house. The sun was still shining and everything seemed calm. But deep down, he knew something was very, very wrong. He could only hope that help would arrive in time to find out what was really happening inside Mrs. Cook's home. Mr. Harris tried to continue his mail route, but his mind was stuck on Mrs. Cooks. He couldn't stop thinking about the blood stains on her pants, the broken vase, and the dark red spots he had glimpsed inside her house. No matter how much he tried to convince himself that it might be nothing, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. After finishing his deliveries, he found himself riding back toward Mrs. Cook's house, even though he hadn't planned to. He was still nervous and unsure of what he would do when he got there, but he knew he couldn't just ignore it. As he approached her house, he noticed that her front curtains were drawn, which was strange because Mrs. Cooks usually kept them open to let in the sunlight. Everything about the scene felt eerie, like the house was hiding something. Mr. Harris parked his bike on the curb and walked up to the front door, his heart pounding in his chest. He hesitated for a moment before knocking, trying to steady his nerves. This time, there was no immediate response. The silence was unnerving, and for a brief second, he considered leaving. Maybe he was making a big deal out of nothing. But then he remembered the look on Mrs. Cook's face, how scared she seemed, and he knew he had to stay. He knocked again, louder this time. After what felt like forever, he heard slow, shuffling footsteps approaching the door. When Mrs. Cooks finally opened it, she peeked out from behind the door, barely showing her face. Her eyes were wide, and she looked even more tired than before, as if she hadn't slept at all. She was still wearing the same pants, and Mr. Harris could see the red stains hadn't been cleaned. "Hello, Mr. Harris," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I told you, I'm fine. You don't have to keep checking on me." Mr. Harris forced a smile, trying to keep his tone light. "I just wanted to make sure, Mrs. Cooks. You didn't seem well earlier, and I was worried about you. Are you sure there's nothing I can do to help?" Mrs. Cooks hesitated. She looked like she was going to say something, but then she glanced nervously over her shoulder, back into the house, and quickly shook her head. No, everything is okay. I just need to rest. Please, don't worry." But as she spoke, Mr. Harris noticed something that made his heart skip a beat. There was a trail of small dark red spots leading down the hallway, past the living room, and disappearing into the shadows of the house. It was the same trail he had seen earlier, but now he could see it more clearly. It wasn't just a few drops. There were many of them, and they seemed to be leading somewhere. Mr. Harris swallowed hard. "Mrs. Cooks, I really think you should let me help you. If you're hurt, we can call someone, or I can." Before he could finish, Mrs. Cooks stepped forward, closing the door slightly, as if trying to block his view. "Please, Mr. Harris," she said, her voice trembling. "Just go home. I'm fine, really. I don't want anyone to see me like this." The way she said it made Mr. Harris feel like she was hiding something. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Was Mrs. Cooks hurt and too scared to ask for help? Or was there something, or someone, in the house that she didn't want him to see? The more he thought about it, the more worried he became. As he stood there, unsure of what to do, he noticed that Mrs. Cooks was glancing over her shoulder again, like she was afraid of being caught. It was then that he realized she wasn't just nervous, she was scared. And if she was scared, then something was definitely wrong. Mr. Harris took a step back, his mind made up. He didn't want to upset Mrs. Cooks, but he couldn't ignore the situation any longer. He had to do something. "All right, Mrs. Cooks," he said softly. "I'll go, but please take care of yourself." She nodded quickly, looking relieved, and started to close the door. But before she could, Mr. Harris added, "I'll see you tomorrow, okay?" Mrs. Cooks hesitated for a moment, then gave a weak smile. "Okay, tomorrow." As soon as the door closed, Mr. Harris stepped off the porch and pulled out his phone. His hands were shaking as he dialed 911. When the operator answered, he took a deep breath and tried to explain what he had seen, his voice trembling. "I'm calling because I'm worried about my neighbor, Mrs. Cooks. She's an elderly woman, and I saw blood stains on her clothes and inside her house. There's more blood. She says she's fine, but I don't think she is." The operator listened carefully and asked him a few questions. Mr. Harris answered as best as he could, all the while glancing nervously at Mrs. Cook's house. He felt a pang of guilt for going behind her back, but he knew he couldn't just walk away. What if she was in serious trouble, and he was the only person who could help? "Please send someone to check on her," he said, his voice barely steady. "I don't know what's going on, but I'm scared something bad might have happened." The operator assured him that they would send officers to the house right away. As Mr. Harris hung up the phone, he felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. He had done the right thing, but now he had to wait. He stood on the sidewalk, staring at Mrs. Cook's closed door, hoping and praying that help would arrive in time. The sun was still shining brightly, but to Mr. Harris, the house seemed darker than ever, as if it was hiding a secret that was just waiting to be uncovered. Mr. Harris stood on the sidewalk, his heart pounding as he watched the house. It felt like hours had passed since he called 911, even though it had only been a few minutes. His mind raced with questions, and he couldn't help but imagine all the terrible things that might be happening behind that closed door. What if Mrs. Cooks was hurt or worse? What if someone else was in the house, making her say everything was okay? Finally, the distant sound of sirens echoed down the street, growing louder and louder until 2 police cars pulled up in front of Mrs. Cook's house. Mr. Harris felt a wave of relief wash over him, but his anxiety didn't disappear. The officers stepped out of their cars and approached him, their expressions serious. "Are you the one who called?" one of the officers asked. He was tall and wore a calm but firm expression. Mr. Harris nodded quickly. "Yes, I'm Mr. Harris, the mailman. I've known Mrs. Cooks for years. She looked really unwell this morning, and I saw blood stains on her pants. There's also a trail of blood inside her house, leading somewhere, and she's acting very scared. She keeps saying everything's fine, but I don't believe her." The officers exchanged a quick glance. Then one of them nodded. "Thank you for letting us know. We'll check on her." Mr. Harris watched nervously as the 2 officers walked up to Mrs. Cook's front door. They knocked firmly, and it wasn't long before the door creaked open, revealing Mrs. Cook's pale face. She looked even more frail and tired than before, and Mr. Harris noticed she had tried to cover the blood stains on her pants with a long sweater, but it wasn't very effective. "Good morning, ma'am," said one of the officers politely. "We received a call from a concerned neighbor. We'd like to come inside and make sure everything's okay." Mrs. Cooks blinked, her eyes wide, and for a moment she seemed frozen. She stammered, I'm fine. Really, there's no need for that. Please, just leave." The officers didn't move. "We understand, but we'd still like to come inside, ma'am. It won't take long." Mrs. Cooks hesitated, her hands trembling as she clutched the doorknob. She glanced over her shoulder into the dark hallway behind her, and Mr. Harris could see the fear in her eyes. It was like she was silently begging the officers not to come in. But they weren't going to leave without checking. "Ma'am, if there's nothing wrong, then there's no reason for us not to come in," said the officer gently, but firmly. "We just want to make sure you're safe." Mrs. Cooks looked down at her feet, her lips quivering, and after what felt like forever, she finally stepped aside and opened the door wider. The officers thanked her and stepped inside, and Mr. Harris couldn't stop himself from inching closer to the house, even though he knew he should stay back. He needed to know what was going on. Inside the house, the officer's eyes immediately fell on the trail of dark red spots that Mr. Harris had mentioned. It led from the front hallway, across the living room, and toward the back of the house. One of the officers asked Mrs. Cooks again if she was hurt, and she just shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "Please, you don't have to go back there," she whispered, her voice barely audible. It's just a mess." But the officers didn't stop. They followed the trail, and Mr. Harris, standing just outside the open door, strained to see what was happening. The tension was unbearable. Then suddenly, he heard a loud gasp from one of the officers, followed by a sharp call for backup. Mr. Harris's heart skipped a beat. What had they found? He felt his whole body tense up as he took a step closer, trying to catch a glimpse of what was inside. Moments later, one of the officers reappeared, his face grim. "Sir, please stay outside," the officer said, holding up a hand to stop Mr. Harris from coming closer. "We need to handle this." But Mr. Harris was already leaning forward, peering past the officer, and that's when he saw it. In the middle of the living room floor lay Mrs. Cook's beloved cat, lifeless and covered in blood. Its small body looked like it had been hurt badly, and Mr. Harris felt a pang of sadness in his chest. Had this been the source of the blood? Had the poor cat been in an accident? Just as he started to feel relieved, thinking maybe it was all just a tragic misunderstanding, one of the officers shouted from the back of the house, "We found someone. He's unconscious." Mr. Harris' blood ran cold. Someone was in the house. He hadn't even considered that possibility. He watched as the officers rushed deeper into the house, and moments later, they came back, carrying a man who looked bruised and beaten. His hands were tied with rope, and his clothes were torn and bloodied. The officers laid him down carefully and checked his pulse, and to Mr. Harris's shock, the man was still breathing. Mrs. Cook stood in the doorway, trembling, and as the officers turned to her, she broke down, tears streaming down her cheeks. I didn't know what else to do," she sobbed. "He broke in last night. He attacked me, and I fought back. I hit him with the vase. I was so scared. I thought he would hurt me. When he fell, I tied him up, but I didn't know how to get help." The officers listened, their expressions softening. One of them gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "You did what you had to do to protect yourself, ma'am. You're safe now. We'll take care of this." Mr. Harris stood there stunned. He never imagined Mrs. Cooks could be involved in something so frightening. She had been hiding her fear, trying to keep everything together, but now the truth was out. The man they found was a burglar who had broken in, and Mrs. Cooks had been brave enough to fight back, even though she was terrified. The police officers carefully lifted the unconscious burglar onto a stretcher while paramedics checked his injuries. Mr. Harris stood outside the house, still trying to process everything he had just witnessed. The scene felt surreal, like something out of a movie. One minute, he was delivering mail on a quiet morning, and the next, he was caught in the middle of a drama he could hardly believe. As the officers secured the scene, one of them approached Mrs. Cooks, who was now sitting on her porch, trembling and holding her hands tightly together. She looked so small and fragile, yet there was a quiet strength in her eyes that Mr. Harris had never noticed before. The officer knelt beside her, speaking softly, trying to reassure her. "Ma'am, you did an incredibly brave thing," he said gently. "I understand it must have been terrifying, but you defended yourself, and that's what matters. We're going to make sure this man is taken to the hospital and then into custody. He won't hurt you again." Mrs. Cooks nodded, her eyes red and swollen from crying. "I didn't mean to hurt him," she whispered, her voice shaky. "I was just so scared. He came out of nowhere, and he was so strong. I didn't know what else to do." The officer nodded understandingly. "It's okay, ma'am. You did what anyone would do in your situation. You protected yourself, and now you're safe. That's all that matters." As the paramedics prepared to transport the burglar, Mr. Harris felt a surge of relief. Knowing that the man would be taken away and that Mrs. Cooks would be safe brought a sense of peace. But he still felt a knot of worry in his chest when he looked at her. She seemed so exhausted, like she hadn't slept at all. He knew she had been through something terrible, and it pained him to see her in such a state. Mr. Harris slowly walked over to where Mrs. Cooks was sitting, taking a deep breath. "Mrs. Cooks," he said softly, trying to get her attention. She looked up at him, her eyes glassy with tears. "I'm so sorry you had to go through this. I had no idea. I wish I could have helped sooner." Mrs. Cooks managed a weak smile, though her lips were still trembling. "You did help, Mr. Harris," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You called for help when I was too scared to. I didn't know what to do. I thought if I told anyone, they wouldn't believe me, or they'd think I was weak." Mr. Harris shook his head, feeling a lump in his throat. "No one would ever think that, Mrs. Cooks. You're one of the strongest people I know," he said. "You were so brave, fighting back and protecting yourself. I'm just glad you're okay." She took a deep breath and wiped her eyes, still looking shaken but grateful. "Thank you, Mr. Harris. I was so scared, but knowing you were out there, watching out for me, it made me feel a little less alone." The paramedics and officers finished their work, and the police assured Mrs. Cooks that they would be in touch soon to take her statement and explain what would happen next. For now, though, they wanted her to rest and take care of herself. They'd promised to keep an eye on the house and make sure she was safe, which seemed to ease some of her fears. As the police cars and ambulance began to pull away, the neighborhood returned to a quiet calm. But Mr. Harris could still feel the tension lingering in the air. He didn't want to leave Mrs. Cooks alone, not after everything that had happened. So he gently asked, "Mrs. Cooks, would you like me to stay for a little while? I can help you clean up or just sit with you. Whatever you need." At first, she hesitated, glancing back at the house as if she was afraid to go back inside. Then she nodded, a small but grateful smile forming on her lips. "I'd like that, Mr. Harris," she said. "Thank you." They both stepped inside, and the house felt different now. It was still the same cozy little home, but the events of the night had cast a shadow over it. The living room was a mess, with broken glass on the floor and the red stains still visible on the carpet. Mrs. Cooks looked around, her expression sad, as if she was seeing the aftermath for the first time. Mr. Harris didn't want her to feel overwhelmed, so he quickly started picking up the broken pieces of the vase, carefully gathering them in a small bag. "I'll take care of this for you," he said. "You should sit down and rest. It's been a rough day." Mrs. Cooks sat down on the couch, clutching a small pillow to her chest, as if it gave her comfort. "I never thought something like this would happen," she said quietly. "I always thought I was safe here, in this little house, but now, I don't know." Mr. Harris stopped what he was doing and turned to her, his expression soft and sincere. "You are safe, Mrs. Cooks, and you'll keep being safe. The police will make sure of that, and so will I," he said firmly. "If you ever need anything, all you have to do is ask. You don't have to go through this alone." Tears welled up in Mrs. Cook's eyes again, but this time they were tears of gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Harris," she said. "I don't know what I would have done without you." They spent the next hour tidying up the house, but more importantly, they spent it talking. Mr. Harris listened as Mrs. Cooks shared bits and pieces of her life, the things that made her happy, and the fears that she had hidden away for so long. It was a small comfort after such a terrible ordeal, but it was exactly what she needed. By the time Mr. Harris was ready to leave, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm golden light through the windows. Mrs. Cooks walked him to the door, and for the first time that day, she looked a little more at peace. "Goodbye, Mr. Harris," she said, "and thank you for everything." Mr. Harris smiled and tipped his hat. "Take care, Mrs. Cooks. I'll see you tomorrow." As he walked back to his bike, he felt a strange mix of emotions. The day had been more intense than any he had ever experienced, but it also reminded him of the power of kindness and community. Sometimes the smallest act of concern could make the biggest difference, and he was grateful that he had been there to help when it mattered most. Thank you so much for watching and being part of our storytelling community. We hope you enjoyed this tale, and we'd love to keep bringing you more. Before you leave, please remember to subscribe. Your support fuels our passion and creativity. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and stay connected for more stories that touch the heart and inspire the soul.